Hi guys, welcome back to History in Stitches. Finally, today I'm bringing you that Jane Addams video I've been promising you. I am sorry I've been busy with Christmas and things like everyone else, but we're going to talk about the amazing Jane Addams and her life and her legacy while we make this hat. Now, I know a lot of you have already seen this pattern and made this hat. Thank you so much for watching that video. But today we're going to do this hat in a different kind of yarn. We're going to use this thicker kind of velvety yarn, and we're going to see how that turns out. So we're going to do that while we talk about Jane Addams. Now, if you don't want to make a hat and you still want to do something for these months of giving, we've got a video on our site about how to make a dog bed that you can donate to local shelters. So that's a good one. And then keep your eyes out, because the next one I'm going to do in the next day or so is this. This is a bird's nest. And you say, why would I want to make a bird's nest? And I say, for the birds, because here in the spring, a lot of wildlife rehabbers are going to actually need these to take care of the baby birds and baby bunnies and things that come in. So we'll do this on our next video. It's a real easy pattern. It's very similar to the dog bed. So in the meantime, grab your stuff and let's talk about Jane Addams. So if you would like to crochet the hat, it's very simple. What I'm using today, I just have a scissors, I have a tapestry needle, I've got measuring tape. I am going to try this one today. I have not tried this yet, but I've got a 5.5 millimeter hook, and I've got this yarn, which I believe, I'm telling you, it came out of my scrap pile, so I'm not 100% sure. I think this is either a 5 or a 6, but it's velvety, like blanket yarn. And we're gonna try that. And I honestly have no idea even when I bought this. So again, this is a good scrap buster project if you want to use some of your scrap yarn up. All right, so for this pattern, it's gonna be really simple. All you're gonna need to do is chain stitch and single crochet. So all you're gonna do first, you're gonna take your yarn, you're gonna loop it around, pull it through like this, and make your slip knot. You need your hook, put that on the hook there, and you're gonna chain. Now, normally I'd say chain 10 or 12, or I'd give you a number, but since this is a new yarn and kind of a new size, I'm gonna chain on enough and then tell you about how long it should be. So you don't have to worry necessarily about what size hook and yarn you're using. We're just gonna worry about the length. So I'm going to start chaining, and to chain, remember, you go over and then you're just going to pull it through, over and pull it through. Now remember, I know if you are a new crocheter, you are like so tense and trying to get everything perfectly right, and your tension is going to be really high. But it's important that you don't make your tension on your chains too tight, because if you do, it's going to be impossible to get your first round of stitches in. Like, that's a very common mistake a lot of first-time crocheters make. Okay, so you're going to make your chains, and we're going to make a chain no matter what size hook and yarn you're using. If you're making an adult hat, you probably want that to be about 14 inches long, your initial chain on. So however many that turns out to be for you, you want it to be about 14 inches long. Now, this is not going to be the brim of your hat, okay? This is going to actually be this part. Let me move this up so you can see. This part of the hat right here. It's gonna go from the top to the bottom, because we're gonna sew this direction for your hat. So once you've got it chained on, you're going to just make a giant rectangle. So whatever stitch you decide to do for that, I'm going to go ahead and do a double crochet for these. And so for a double crochet, generally what you recommend is you do 2 extra chains there. So we're going to do those 2 chains, and then you're going to start in the 3rd chain from the hook. So not this one, not this one, but you're going to start in this 3rd chain here. And so to double crochet, you go around, you're going to go 1, 2, 3rd from hook, go through, grab that yarn. Now you should have 3 loops on your hook. You're going to wrap around again, go through the first 2, wrap around again, go through the second 2, and that makes your first double crochet. So literally, you're going to do that all the way down. Chain 2, do that all the way back until you have a giant rectangle. And that's what you're going to do the whole time that we talk about Jane Addams. And then when we're done talking about Miss Addams, I'll show you how to finish up your hat. All right, so while we're working on our hats, let's talk about Jane Addams. And if you don't know who she is, if you've never heard of her, that's okay. We're going to cover a lot of her life, but just kind of basic knowledge. She was known as just being a fantastic and brilliant social reformer. If you've ever heard of Hull House in Chicago, her and her friend Ellen are the two people that started that, but we're going to talk about all of that and what she did and who was Ellen and all of that jazz. So I've got a lot of notes, so just keep crocheting your helpful project while we talk about Jane Addams. So Jane was born September 6th, 1860, just before the Civil War started. She was born in Cedarville, Illinois, and her real name was Laura Jane Addams, but she went by her middle name of Jane. She was the 8th of 9 kids, but only, how many? 5. Just only 5 survived past the age of 2, which was not abnormal, but still sad. Her mother passed away when she was just a toddler, and eventually her dad remarried a widow, and this widow had 2 sons of her own, so their family got even a little bit bigger. They had 2 stepbrothers and a new mom to live with them. Dad was well off. He was a wealthy miller. He owned a mill in town, and he also was the state senator of Illinois for a while. They lived in a place called Cedarville, Illinois. So he was a local politician. He was a pretty decent philanthropist on his own. He ran a library out of his house, like not a real library, but you know, he had a lot of books and he'd let local people borrow them, and he encouraged people to read. So that's something that Jane took with her later when she started Hull House. But he was a state senator. He was a state senator in Illinois before the Civil War. So you can guess, can you guess who one of his good buddies was? All right, time's up. He was really good friends with Abe Lincoln, and it was always kind of a joke between them that Abe Lincoln would start all of his letters to her father as my dearest double D Addams, because that branch of the Addams family uses 2 D's. They spell it A-D-D-A-M-S rather than A-D-A-M-S. So that was always the joke between her dad and Lincoln. So Jane was not a healthy child. She had Pott's disease, which is really, it's spinal tuberculosis. And so I did some looking. Spinal tuberculosis it's the same bacteria that causes tuberculosis, but it does not settle in your lungs. It travels through your bloodstream and settles in your spine. And it can be very painful, and it caused her to have a very crooked back, and she just was never a very healthy person. But eventually, though, she did have surgery to remedy it. It actually turned out to be one of her stepbrothers that did the surgery, and it was a long recovery, but it did eventually help her to walk a little straighter and feel a little better. So she was typical child. She read a lot. She really enjoyed reading Charles Dickens and Louisa May Alcott. She loved the book Little Woman. And then when she got old enough, she wanted to go away to college, but Dad did not want her to do that. So she stuck close to home and ended up going to a place called Rockford Female Seminary, which later turned into Rockford College. And it turned into Rockford College the year after she graduated, but she ended up with a bachelor's degree from Rockford College. So she attended Rockford Female Seminary, even though it wasn't exactly where she wanted to be. She's a pretty good student, though she got into some trouble. Apparently, one year over break, her and some of her friends decided to read a book. It's a book called Confessions of an English Opium Eater by Thomas De Quincey. And apparently this man, you can read it, it's on Project Gutenberg if you want, I'll link it in the description. But he was addicted to laudanum, which had opium in it. And he wrote all about his experiences and the dreams he would have and the nightmares and all of the walks he'd take throughout London while he was high on laudanum. And the girls read this book apparently and decided that they wanted to really get into his mind. And so they all took opium one day over one of their school breaks. And apparently they were found by a teacher, and the teacher quickly confiscated both the opium and the books, and they were all sequestered to their rooms for the rest of break. So good student, but she definitely could be a little naughty at times. She graduated, and her intent was to go to medical school, and she did attend medical school for a little bit. But like I said, she had never been a very healthy person, and the stress of medical school it got to her, and it was, very physical and stressful, and medical school is not known for being an easy path. So she stopped after about a year and did not continue to get her medical degree. Being wealthy, she wanted to still figure out kind of what she wanted to do with her life. Medical school didn't work out. So what do the wealthy do when they want to figure it out? They take a trip to Europe, of course. So her and her friend Ellen, they went and toured Europe. I think they went twice actually. But on one of the trips they were in England, and they visited a place called Toynbee Hall. And Toynbee Hall was a famous settlement house in England. And when they visited there, Jane kind of thought, okay, this is it. This is what I want to do with my life. So if you don't know what a settlement house is a place to help the community. It's usually made in some sort of poverty-stricken community, and it is one of those deals where they do charity, but they very much believe in a hand up rather than a hand out sort of thing. And they also believe that if you truly want to help the community, you need to live in that community and experience the things that the people in that community experience, and be down there with those people and really be helping. So Jane and Ellen decided they were going to start one of these settlement houses, and they came back to America and in Chicago, and they found a neighborhood that they liked, and they started a settlement house, which is known as Hull House. So Hull House, it was at 800, let me get this right because it's still there, it's a museum, 800 South Halsted Street, and I believe it is on University of Illinois Chicago campus now. I think that the campus grew around it. But originally it was owned by a guy named Charles J. Hull. And he was a self-made millionaire. He was a real estate guy in Chicago. And he was no slouch when it came to philanthropy either. He was another hand up, hand out kind of guy. And he was known for encouraging people to buy and own land. He really thought that people needed to own their own land, and to help them do that, he was famous for kind of starting the idea of mortgages, where he'd let people pay just a little bit at a time to own their own land. He was not great, apparently, about just giving out money, but apparently he was fantastic about giving out jobs. If somebody needed a job, he'd find a place for them to work and put them to work so they could make it on their own. He also was known for building houses in kind of communities that needed a little boost. So he'd go build a summer house in this neighborhood to kind of try and jumpstart the economy of that neighborhood. And Hull House was one of those houses that he did that with. By the time Jane and Ellen were looking for a house, he had passed away and left the house to his second wife, Helen Hull. And she was totally on board with what Jane and Ellen were starting to do, and gave them a rent-free lease for like 25 years. So that was a fantastic start for them. And so they started the Hull House there at 800 South Halsted Street in Charles J. Hull's old house. The Hull House, it opened in 1889, and it started just with kind of a focus on education. It started as a kindergarten. And apparently when they opened, they already had a waiting list for their kindergarten. But very quickly it expanded beyond kindergarten. It expanded to childcare, and then classes, and boarders could live there. And it encouraged other wealthy people, especially wealthy women that were kind of looking for something to do, because, you know, your options were limited as a woman back then. But it attracted a lot of educated women that really wanted to get involved and do something. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But Hull House eventually expanded, and they did the kindergarten, they did the daycare, they had a library and art galleries and art classes. It was a neighborhood with a very high immigrant population. And so they started doing cooking classes and sewing classes and English classes and citizenship classes. Any need that kind of popped up, they were there to kind of help that need and help the community just better themselves in any way that they could. So that was the basis of Hull House. Crazy enough, Hull House lasted like 120 years. It went into bankruptcy, I believe. They ran out of money as recently as 2012. And I read some statistics. Let me look at them so I don't get them wrong. So in 2012, the article from 2012, when it went out of business, said that in recent years, Hull House had almost 4 dozen locations throughout Chicago, and it was serving 60,000 people a year with childcare, domestic abuse counseling, job training, and housing assistance. But in 2012, it looks like they just ran out of money and went bankrupt. But it lasted a very, very long time. So Hull House was a big deal. It was one of the very first settlement houses. I think actually the first settlement house here in the United States. But not too long after it opened, there were over 100 settlement houses. She kind of started a revolution with what she was doing. So not only did it help the people that were there in that neighborhood, the people that were attracted to Hull House went on to do other amazing things. So I'm going to tell you about 4 of the ladies that were at Hull House at one point and what they did. But there were so many more, especially if you count all the other people that were inspired at all the other settlement houses, because Jane opened her settlement house. So the 4 I'm going to tell you about just real quick. Florence Kelly. She was working at Hull House with Jane. She worked a lot on eliminating child labor. She actually was very smart. She went to Cornell at age 16, graduated, married, had 3 kids, and quickly found out that her husband was abusive. So she left him, picked up with the kids, and moved into Hull House in Chicago and divorced her husband that was abusive. And then she just got to work doing her own thing. She worked a lot to eliminate child labor. She was a lawyer. She was a factory inspector. She helped to pass the 1893 Factory Act in Illinois, which said that no kids under 14 could have a job. And she really worked to kind of better the ethics of the businesses there in the area. So she actually created something called the white label. And you know, when you go to the grocery store now, you can look at the labels and see, oh, it's vegan, or it's certified organic, or what's the other one where it's like ethically produced, like if you get chocolate or whatever. And she made a label like that. It was called a white label, and it certified that whatever business the product was made from used ethical child labor standards. So that was kind of neat. She also helped us start the NAACP, and just generally all around awesome lady in her own right. Another one was Julie Lathrop. She She visited a lot of mental hospitals and all sorts of things like that. So she worked to reform mental hospitals and to get female doctors in women's wards at regular hospitals, which was a big deal at the time. She was big into juvenile justice reform. So she had visited a lot of prisons and found boys as young as 10 in adult prisons for very minor infractions. But their parents couldn't pay the fines to get them out, so they just sat there. And she started kind of the juvenile justice system. In 1899, they actually opened the Cook County, what was it called? Cook County Juvenile Court. And they opened that across the street from Hull House. And a lot of people from Hull House would go over and help the lawyers with the boys and advocate for the kids. And they really focused on reform rather than prison with the kids. And so she did a lot of work with the juvenile justice system. Dr. Alice Hamilton spent some time at the Hull House. So she started a well baby clinic at the Hull House. But she was also highly involved trying to figure out health for factory workers. And not necessarily just for the factory, like the obvious things where, you know, you have this kid working on a machine and they get their arm cut off because the safety stuff wasn't there. Like she was concerned about that too, but she was very concerned about the long-term things going on as far as disease and things in the neighborhood. So she did a lot of work with, I believe, typhoid and how that traveled in the water. But she also did one of the first long-term kind of studies and really dug into the effects and the long-term effects of lead poisoning, especially as it related to factory workers. She was the very first female faculty member at Harvard, so another awesome lady. So Frances Perkins was another one that spent some time at Hull House, and she was another lady very concerned with working conditions and welfare and things like that. She was unfortunate enough, I think the word is unfortunate enough, to witness the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which, if you don't know about that, was a terrible fire that happened in a factory. And a lot of people died just because basic safety regulations were not in effect, basically. So she witnessed that and then used that as motivation to really make some big reforms. She was appointed as, what was her official title? She, I think, was the secretary on the Committee for Safety for the City of New York, and appointed as that by Governor Theodore Roosevelt. So she worked with, you know, safety in factories and things like that. And then she's probably most famous for being the very first female member of the presidential cabinet. She was appointed as Secretary of Labor, and she did a lot of work during that administration on the New Deal and just general social welfare and trying to get Social Security and minimum wage and things like that passed. So the Hull House turned out some very awesome people, in addition to all of the good work that it did for the community in general. Jane worked at the Hull House pretty much her whole life. That was kind of her passion, but she did do more than just the Hull House. When her father passed away, he left her quite a bit of money, and she, for a long time, used that money to supplement the Hull House because it was not self-supporting. And then she eventually ended up on the speaker circuit doing speeches to get more money for Hull House. She started looking around, and, you know, they were making big dents in the health and the safety and all of the things in the community, but there's only so much you can do from one place. And so she started kind of looking around to see what other issues there were. At one point, she realized that people were getting sick because the trash was not being picked up. Because, of course, in corrupt Chicago, they had given the trash contract to a guy that basically took the money and then never picked up the trash. So she did a lot of work hassling people about that and trying to get the trash picked up. And for a while, she actually got the job as trash inspector, and she would follow these crews around and make sure that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. She did a lot of speeches. She worked, her and her wife, Mary. We haven't talked about Mary yet. Goodness, let me tell you about Mary. Okay. Ellen and Jane started the Hull House. Ellen was awesome, but most people kind of agree that she kind of got burnt out. Like Jane was apparently able to see the suffering and kind of step back and kind of be one of those people that was like, okay, we're going to work for it and do what we can do, but we can only do what we can do. And apparently Ellen was one of the people that, you know, like a lot of us, that you try and help and you can't make a big enough dent, and then you just get upset and frustrated because there's so much you feel like you can't do to help. And so she stepped away after a little while. But Mary Rose Smith came on the scene. She was a friend of one of the ladies teaching kindergarten there at the time, and she started working at the Hull House, and her and Jane had a 40-year relationship. Now, this is a huge debate if you listen to anything about Jane Addams, because some people are like, oh, it was just the way of the times, like women could live together and support each other and da 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 da, which, yeah, true, totally true. But apparently Jane would refer to her as her wife, and was it Jane that had a portrait of Mary, or Mary that had a portrait of Jane? I don't remember. One of the two had a portrait of the other one, that anytime they'd travel, they'd carry this huge portrait of them around, like, you know. And Rachel, if you're listening, I love you, girl, but I'm not going to carry your portrait to Europe. So, like, it's always been a debate. Were they lesbians? Were they friends? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I guess if they were lesbians, then that would be awesome for the LGBT community. But beyond that, it doesn't matter one whit about her work, if she was or not. She was awesome. Mary was awesome. They were great. Who cares? Anyway, so Mary and her worked together to work on some legislation to restrict child labor. And apparently they were doing so well that Jane was offered quite a substantial bribe to stop. And she was highly offended that people thought she would stop just because she was offered money. And she didn't stop, and they got it passed. So that's kind of awesome. Another thing Jane was kind of uniquely qualified for is, you know, she had grown up fairly wealthy. And so she kind of had a foot in both worlds. And she knew Mr. Pullman. And so when the Pullman Railroad strike happened, she offered to be a mediator. So she knew Mr. Pullman, and she knew the people striking against Mr. Pullman, and she thought she could come in and mediate it. Mediation was unsuccessful, and eventually that strike was settled with some government intervention. And actually, if you didn't know, the Pullman strike is actually the reason we have Labor Day. So yay for that, I guess. She, like I said, she did a lot of speaking, and she toured Europe. She got a chance to meet Leo Tolstoy, who was her, like, absolute hero. And in the case of don't ever meet your heroes, she was highly disappointed when she met him, because apparently he, you know, she tried to live out what he said, but he very much would just eat porridge and live very, very low on the hog. And she was still in her fancy dresses and things. She was doing what she could to help, but she still was a wealthy lady. And he apparently very much disapproved of the way she dressed and what she ate and all of those things. So she kind of gave up on him after that. Eventually she worked to help get the NAACP started. She got very involved in women's suffrage. And then her downfall. She was very much for peace. She did not want the United States involved in World War I. And she actually traveled to The Hague. She was the chairwoman of the Women's International Congress. And she did some speeches there about peace and treaties and what they they should do if they offered a treaty and all sorts of things like that. But she also had the chance while she was there to tour around and meet some of the soldiers that were fighting in the war. And apparently at one point she made a statement to a newspaper about how the boys that she met didn't even know what they were fighting for and couldn't fight without being high or drunk, I think is what she said, something to that extent. And she just meant, we believe, that the war was awful and the guys didn't want to fight because they didn't understand exactly why they were fighting, and they had to get drunk to like wipe away all their emotions about the war and things like that. But of course people took it out of context and thought that she was calling all of the soldiers cowards because they couldn't fight without being drunk, which is probably not at all what she meant. So she was demonized for quite a while. Fast forward to the end of the war and a little bit beyond that, and she was actually called by one of the newspapers the most powerful and dangerous woman in the world, because think we just went through the whole World War I stuff, and there's communism happening and all this stuff is happening, and heaven forbid you help the poor because you must be a communist. And so she went through kind of this whole Red Scare thing where people thought she was a communist because she was helping the poor and wanted peace and yada yada. But come time for the Depression, and lo and behold, now a lot of people are poor and they needed her again. So her popularity kind of went up during the Depression. In fact, in 1931, she was the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. She could not be there to accept because she was sick. And this is where, okay, I'm going to tell you this story because I did find it from a fairly reputable source, but I don't know. Apparently, when she was sick, she had cancer, and the doctors took out the cancer and she got better and went along her way, but they never told her she had cancer. And then in 1935, when she got very, very sick, they had to do a surgery to remove an intestinal blockage, which apparently the doctors suspected was cancer, but they still didn't tell her. And then when they got in there, apparently the cancer had spread just enormously, and they knew she didn't have very long to live, but yet they still didn't tell her she had cancer, and she died 3 days later. So apparently she died never knowing that she'd had cancer for at least 4 years. I don't know. But she did pass away, and like we said before, work at Hull House continued until 2012, and she was just a pretty phenomenal lady all the way around. One more stories that I have to tell you, because I am kind of a ghosty girl, and you all know that if you've ever seen my other channel, Fantastic Footnotes. We talk about a bunch of paranormal stuff over there. But Hull House is actually known for being one of the most haunted buildings in Chicago. Apparently it's on a bunch of ghost tours and all sorts of things like that. The crazy thing is that it was haunted even when Jane was there. And she makes mention in some of her writings about the ghost that lived in the attic. And the ghost that lives in the attic is known as the Lady in White. And people think that she's actually Millicent Hull, who was Charles Hull's first wife. And Jane talks about her being up there and talks about how any of the people that were boarding on the second floor, they'd leave a pitcher of water either on the stairs or in front of the door to the attic, because you know the old adage that spirits can't cross running water. Now, to me, a pitcher is not running, but you know, you do what you have to do to sleep at night. So she made mention of that in some of her writings, and people still claim to see the Lady in White to this day. People say they hear children playing and footsteps in the hallway, and things in the library get moved around. But probably the most famous ghosty story of the Hull House is the story of the Devil Baby, which also happened when Jane was there. So, like I said, the Hull House was in a community with lots of immigrants. And apparently each ethnic group there in that community kind of has their own story of how the devil baby came to be. But the one that I kept seeing popping up over and over was that there was an immigrant woman. She was married to an atheist. She was very Christian and wanted some picture. I don't know if it was Jesus. I've seen Mary. Some picture of a religious idol hung up in their house. And supposedly her atheist husband said that he would rather have the devil as a baby than to have this picture hung up in their house. So of course, when the baby was born, it turned out to be a devil baby, and it was born with horns and smoking a cigar and came out cursing at all of the midwives, and was immediately brought by the midwives to the Hull house and hidden in the attic. And so apparently this was a big deal for Hull House for about 6 weeks. These stories would run in the newspaper, and people would just show up at the door of Hull House demanding to see the devil baby. And Jane was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. We don't have a devil baby here. But apparently it was a big deal for a little while, and really made Jane apparently wonder, like, why do they believe this? What do they need from this story that they're believing this whole thing about a devil baby? So anyway, that's kind of a crazy paranormal twist to the whole Hull House situation. But that's about all I have to share with you about Jane. But I do like one of her quotes. She said, "Action is indeed the sole medium of expression for ethics," which basically boils down to don't just talk the talk, walk the walk, which is what we're all doing by making hats for homeless people today. So keep carrying on. Keep working on your hat. I'll show you. I said about 19 inches, but that does depend on how much it stretches. So what you want to do is you want to kind of fold it up as if you're going to wear it, because this hat will have a fold in it like that. It'll have a little rim. And so you want to fold it and then put it around your head as if it was a hat. And then when you can comfortably stitch the two ends together, you know it's big enough. But don't make it too big, because if it's too big, it doesn't have to stretch and then it's just going to fall over your eyes. So when you've got it the width that you want it, come back and I'll show you how to finish it up. Okay, so we got our hat to the size we wanted. Mine did turn out to be right about 19 inches side to side. So you're going to fold it in half with your stitches being parallel to that fold, because these are the top and the bottom of the hat. This are the sides of the hat. So you want to make sure your fold is parallel to your stitching. What you're going to do is on this last stitch, you're going to fasten off, but leave yourself a big tail. I always end up leaving too much of a tail, but I guess too much is better than not enough. So leave a big tail. And then go ahead and fasten off, pull that last stitch all the way through. And then you're going to need your tapestry needle, because what we're going to do is we're going to sew the side up. Okay, so we fastened off. We're going to line this up, thread our tapestry needle onto the tail. And you're just gonna real carefully just whip stitch all the way down the side of this hat. So just make sure you're getting both sides. Go all the way down. Okay, so once you're at the end, you want to just kind of make sure that there's not one side you like better. You just want to make sure that the side you like least turns out to be the inside of your hat. So my one side looks like that, one side looks like that. I think I want this to be the outside of my hat, though it will get folded and you will see a little bit of this seam. But for the most part, I want this to be the outside. So if I want this to be the outside of the hat when I'm done, this part needs to stay on the inside when we do the next step. So for the next step, we're just gonna gather the top up here and pull it together like this so that it turns into a hat. So you're not gonna need to fasten off or anything. You just leave your tapestry needle attached, and you're just gonna go through side to side and gather up the very top stitches of this hat. Now I'd suggest you kind of pull it through as you go. It makes it easier to tighten it up in the end. And my yarn's getting a little funkified because I've got that velvet yarn and it's kind of got a little hole. Not a hole, but it's separated a little bit. So I'm gonna have to maybe go a little bit slower. But you're just gonna do this all the way down this side and then all the way around. So that way when you pull the string, you're gonna gather it all together. So go ahead and work through that. Okay, so when you get to the end, you're gonna pull it tight. And usually it will get tight enough, but if you feel like there's still a hole in this, you are welcome to kind of whip stitch it closed with a couple stitches. So just go through there at the top and pull it tight. Go through here one more time, and then just tie your regular sewing knot. So before you get all the way through with this loop, take your needle and go back through the opposite side, and that'll make a knot. I'd do 2 or 3 just to make sure it stays. Just like that. And then you can, when you're still attached, this is going to be the inside of your hat. So you can kind of just take this needle with the remaining thread and just kind of hide the thread. Just weave in the ends a little bit. Just down one side. Go backwards. And then you can cut that tail and you are done. You've got a hat. I'll show you what it looks like when it's folded here in just a second. Okay, so I'll weave my end in. Cut that there. This is going to be the inside, so I turn it right side out. And here we go. We have a hat. Fold it up like that, so you get a cute little brim, and you have just finished your Jane Addams hat.